All right, we've been going through John. We're starting to go through John. Last week was the first Sunday for that, and as you may recall, last week I was talking about how John set these things down in his gospel very deliberately in a certain order, and he had a point to how he organized it, and it was all to present Jesus to us in a really balanced but also just such a way that really floors us. That's why that the Gospel of John has been so beloved by Christians throughout the generations. And a lot of scholars I mentioned, a lot of scholars call the first half or so, about chapters 1 through 12, they have their nickname for it or something, I don't know what you would call it, is the book of signs, and then the second part from 13 to 21, the book of glory, because in the first part Jesus is doing a lot of the signs, and in the second part he's revealing his glory, the hour of his glory, which is when he goes to the cross, right? And so in that first half, though, in the book of signs part that they call it, that first 12 chapters, there's also some subdivisions in there where John takes these stories and there's kind of two halves there, and he presents Jesus in all these events or situations or places that are fundamental to Judaism, but there's a twist, right? In each of these, Jesus comes in, but the symbols that are associated with these events, he kind of takes them over and shows how they're pointing to him and how he's the one that these symbols are about. And how he makes his identity clear when he does that. And then he also, in each of these cases, he provides something that event promises in abundance, right? Something that's associated with that event, he provides it in complete abundance. Think of the manna from Passover and when he fed the 5,000, right? And then lastly, another kind of general pattern here is that he's usually misunderstood along the way. There's something that he says or does that gets misinterpreted or really leaves people scratching their heads. And the kind of breakdown is the first bit. There's four kind of institutions of Judaism, things that were really important, and then the second is some of the festivals, right? So the first one is, there, he goes to a wedding, the wedding at Cana. He goes to the temple in the second part of chapter 2. That's where he's upending the tables and driving out all the people selling, and buying animals. Then in chapter 3, he visits a rabbi, Nicodemus, another kind of institution, right? The teacher, the rabbi. And then lastly, he's at a well in Samaria. And then in the second part, he goes to, there's an event associated with the Sabbath, with the Passover, with the Feast of Tabernacles, and with the Feast of Rededication or Hanukkah. And so what we're going to do today, because we're not going through every single thing in John as we're going through this, but we're talking and focusing mainly on the signs that he did. There's 7 of them, and the 7 times that he said, I am something, right? And so today we're going to talk about the first 2 signs, and they're around this institution parts, the wedding, temple, rabbi, and well. They're kind of like bookends to that. There's a bit of symmetry there that John put in there, and so we're going to look at that today. And so today, I'm going to start with the wedding at Cana, right, where he turned the water into wine. And we're going to talk about that, and then the last bit is when he heals a sick boy, and we'll get to that later. So you guys ready? Okay, all right. So just some background. Cana is a village. It's near Nazareth. It's up in the hills a little bit, 4 miles away, 12 miles away, depending on, different scholars think it was this town or that town. But it's close, right? So it'd be natural for the scripture we're about to read that says Jesus was there with his family, with Mary and his brothers and sisters, and that they were invited. So it'd be natural for him to invite it because it was kind of a nearby town, right? And you got to know that culturally, wedding banquets were really important. Like they were a big deal. Usually they'd be planned well in advance. It was one of the major celebrations of the year. Somebody in town is getting married, and it was, a big thing. And there's a lot of customs associated with it. And, you wanted to do things, you wanted to be a good host, do things a certain way because things were expected, right? To have a kind of a successful wedding banquet, let's say. And so there were elaborate preparations. I mean, it could last up to a week, this banquet, this feast. There's other parables that Jesus tells in the Gospels, like the parable of the 10 virgins waiting for the groom to come, right? That's like a practice they had. He would come and show up at night to the bride's house and take her to his house, and then the wedding and the party starts, right? And so it's a big deal. It's a big deal, and there'd be a betrothal at first, and then the wedding maybe a year later. And a betrothal is kind of like our engagement today, only a lot more serious, right? Engagement, you could say, is an intent to marry, but a betrothal was like a commitment to marry, right? So when it says that Joseph and Mary were betrothed, and it says that he was thinking of divorcing her quietly, I mean, it was because they weren't married yet, but they were committed to get married, right? And so that survives in our in the traditional wedding ceremonies, the part where we say, do you take so and so to be your husband or wife, and do you promise to love, honor, cherish them? That part's called the betrothal, and then the part that we say I do to, and then the next part where we say I take thee to be my wife or husband, and for rich or for poor, all that, the traditional bit, that's the actual vow, right? And so but in Judaism at this time, those weren't in one ceremony. Those were separate things, right? So all this to say, it's a big deal, right? This is why it's an institution kind of Judaism. Like this is a thing, and when there's some other reasons too that we'll get into as we read this. So let's without much further ado, let's go ahead and read it, and we'll stop as we go at a few places and just point out a few things, and then we'll go on to what this has to say for us today. So it's in John chapter 2. Starting in verse 1. It says, on the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Running out of wine is a big deal. Those of us that kind of grew up in the South, right? When people come over to the house, like you don't want to run out of food, right? And I'm not saying that's exclusive to the South, but like it's some southern place like that's a big deal. Like you better have like extra. That's what you want. You want to have tons of leftovers at the end, because at least you're not going to run out. Yeah, I see. Yep. Running out of wine at a wedding banquet in the Jewish culture was a big problem. Here's Jesus' reply. Jesus said to her, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Very curious interaction that much has been made of. Firstly, I just want to say that when he says woman, that's just a formal, a respectful address, right? It's not like we say today, woman, what's wrong? Right? It's not that. It sounds strange to us now. But Jesus uses this in other places. When he's talking to the woman at the well in Samaria, he says there's a part where he says, "Woman, blah blah blah." Right? He's talking to the woman caught in adultery later in John. When he's talking to his mother again at the cross, he says, "Woman, behold your son," and then he looks to the disciple and says, "Behold your mother." Right? It's just a formal address, right? It's not disrespectful or anything. It's just very formal. And then the other part of his answer, what does this have to do with me, also kind of might sound like a little bit rude. It's not so much that it's rude, it's just not very flexible. like what Jesus is saying, okay, I know this concerns you, but what does it have to do with me? Like, I know you're worried about the wine having run out, but what does it have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. And the word hour in John, he always uses that word, and this is why I picked to use the ESV translation today, because sometimes I can say time and all that, and that's okay, but you have to know that hour, ora in Greek, is a special word that in the Gospel of John he always uses to refer to Jesus' work on the cross. Right, so when he says, "My hour has not yet come," right, and so it has a bigger meaning here. I mean, in a literal sense, it means a period of time, like an hour, but for John, he uses it in a way that means like a defined moment, a divine period where something's accomplished, right, and it's Jesus' work on the cross, and he says, "My time has not yet come." So, with that kind of weird exchange, between Mary and Jesus, Mary says in the next verse, his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." So she kind of is also being a little inflexible. And for whatever reason, Jesus went with it. I really don't know why. But I don't know if he changed his mind, if he realized that God was doing something here, if he was moved, right? A lot of times the gospel says that Jesus was moved with compassion about something, and then he would act, right? So I don't know what it was of those things. The text doesn't say, and because it's not important. It's one reason the text doesn't say. But verse 6, now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Those are some big jars. Some people think it's significant there was 6. That's kind of like man's number in the Bible, right? 1 short of 7, which is God's number. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And then he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, I like how John just kind of slips that in there. Oh, by the way, now it was wine. Up to that, if you've never read this story, you're thinking, okay, they're taking some water to this guy. And he did not know where it came from, the master of the feast. And John says, parenthetically, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." That's a key verse in this. He makes this observation. Everybody usually serves the good wine first, and then when people are kind of loosened up a little bit, not really caring so much what it might taste like, then you can kind of get rid of the less good wine. And the emphasis here is on 2 things. 1, the quality of the wine. It was better. And 2, the timing of the wine. It was last. The last part was better. The first part was not so good. And those are the key things that this verse is bringing out. And we'll get into that a little bit in a minute. Verse 11, this is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and sisters, and they stayed there a few days. Cana was up in the hills, Capernaum was down by the sea, so they went down. But this word signs, also a deliberate use by John in his gospel. He doesn't he prefers the word signs, sometimes the word works, but rarely the word miracles, which is what the other gospels use. Right? And so he uses signs. And the thing is that a miracle emphasizes the power. The word miracle emphasizes the power that comes with this sign. And it's usually received with awe, right? But the word sign is emphasizing that there's some divine revelation that is happening here, or is at least available, right? This is pointing to something, right? So John wants to use the word sign to emphasize that this isn't about the miraculous power that was displayed. Yes, that happened, but it's pointing to something. It's pointing to something. God is disclosing something about himself that had, up to that point had been hidden. So, that's the story of the wedding at Cana. We've all read it before, I think, for the most part. Now, let's talk about what this means to us. First, I want to say a few things that it's not really about. And as an aside, we got to be really careful when we're reading some passages, especially when they're kind of lodged in our collective conscious, like you kind of grow up hearing certain things about it, and you kind of automatically go there. This isn't about marriage, the sanctity of marriage or something like that. Yes, Jesus was at a wedding. Yes, Jesus is holy. That's not what the story is about. That's not the point of the story. It's also not about whether Christians can or can't drink. How many of you guys have heard that one associated with this? Oh, but it was grape juice. No, it wasn't grape juice. But that's not what it's about. That's not what it's about. It's also not about Jesus versus Mary, like it's been used in that, especially in like Catholic circles and stuff. There's been some theology hung off of that branch. Also, not the point of this story, not why John put it in there. And so I'll just say, like I said, as an aside, that we got to be careful on what when we read these, to focus on what's the main flow, what is God. Yes, there might be some nice little nuggets that we can learn here. I mean, Jesus was not antisocial, right? We went to all these weddings. He was not abstaining, for example. I could say all that, but that's not what this story is about, and it's not the thing that we need to be meditating on, asking the Lord to reveal some extra thing about, right? You guys get what I'm saying? So, having said that, let me point out some things that it is about. One is just on the practical side, a very practical side, where Jesus is rescuing a social disaster. Like, this is an absolute disaster for the wedding host. No wine. I don't know how many more days of this feasting they had, but it wasn't going to last long if they didn't have any more wine. This is a disaster, a cause of some shame. They're going to be talking the next year, or at least until the next wedding, about that last wedding where they ran out of wine. And Jesus, he just filled a material need, and that says that he cares about the little things. There's other things that say in the Bible that say that too. This is one. He cares about the little things. The things that matter to us matter to him. I was reading in Samuel. I've been reading that a little bit with Kai, and when Saul meets Samuel and gets anointed as king and all that, the reason they ran into each other is that because he was looking for his donkeys. Saul was. He'd lost some donkeys, and he's wandering around for days looking for them. He decides to go ask Samuel. He's a prophet. Maybe he knows where my donkeys are. And the first thing that Samuel said was not, "Why is your mind on the things of the world? You need to have your mind on the things above. You're going to be king. Forget about those donkeys." No. The first thing he says is, "Okay, I'm going to tell you some heavy stuff right now, but before we get into it, just let me say your donkeys are fine." Right? They've been found. They're actually already. I mean, we're talking about, for us, it's like losing a car. I mean, these are valuable animals that perform a service in a farming community. It's not something. This is why this guy sent his, and there was several donkeys, right? This is why this guy sent his son out to go find these animals. And so he cares about the little things. He cares about the little things. I remember hearing a story of a man who owned he's a pastor now. At the time, I think he was kind of bivocational, maybe not, I don't know. Owned a car repair shop and just struggling to make ends meet, to pay with this business to keep it afloat. And customers were bringing cars, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with them. And the mechanics were like, I don't know. And whenever the mechanics, it's not all the time, but whenever the mechanics didn't know what was it, he said, I'd send them for a long lunch, and then I'd lay on top of the car and say, Lord, what's wrong with this car? The Lord told him. The Lord told him, it's this, it's that. Stuff that he was like, I don't know how long it would have been before we looked there. He cares about the little things. That's one thing this story tells us on a practical side. Now, the biggest implications are, however, on a more spiritual side. This story is heavily symbolic. I want to read something that I came across that I think says something really important about this. This is a story that makes a sweeping commentary on the world into which Jesus is coming. They have no wine is not simply a comment by Mary about the panic of the wedding host. It is a theological statement about Judaism that is now meeting its Messiah at his very first miracle. This story is about messianic replacement and abundance. Now, the wedding banquet was just full of meaning in the Jewish culture. In Jewish literature, it was the thing at the end, in the last day, the day of the Lord, right? We're going to all be in a banquet. That's why Jesus told all these parables about people at a banquet, right? And what happens when you sit at the front and you get demoted to the back, or all those different stories that he told. And John, in the book of Revelation, that's why he talks about the wedding supper of the Lamb. I mean, because he's pulling on all that symbolism in Jewish literature and culture. The wedding banquet means something, and John intends for us to interpret the story symbolically as well as literally. I won't, for time, I won't get into them, but Isaiah 25, 6 through 9 is a great passage that mentions this feast, where God's saying, in that day, we're going to gather everyone to this feast. And there's other passages in Hosea 2, in Joel 2, in Joel 3, Amos, where it talks about wine and other things like oil and grain being in abundance in that day, in the last day, the day of the Lord. And so the fact that it was also wine that was the issue, and wine that he supplied. Remember I said we find Jesus in these situations that are a big important event or institution or place in Judaism, and then Jesus comes in and he's using the symbols and the things associated that with to say something about his identity. And then secondly, he's providing something in abundance that event supplies, and then he gets misunderstood along the way too. So this is what he's doing here. The wine is symbolic also of all that provision from the Lord. And what is he doing? He's replacing these stone jars that were used for purification. Well, now they're empty. Their function in the old Jewish culture, like that's been supplanted by this new function, which is new wine. And it's really superior wine. That's even more important, that the thing that came later was better than the thing that came first, right? The old covenant. Paul in Corinthians pulls on this idea later, right? He says if the old covenant was revealed with such glory, Moses on the mountain, all this, how much more the new covenant? right? The new is superior to the old. The old has been supplanted. These jars, it can't be used right now for purification. They have wine in them. There's no water in them. And to echo the verse 11, this, the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, manifested his glory. The glory of God seen in the Son. He's become visible in human form to us. Revealed, unveiled for the first time. So this says some things about, I'll use a few terms to kind of describe these two sides. In our seeking God, the things we do to be close to him, to serve him, to honor him, to worship him, to follow his commandments, there's the form that we do, and there's the practice that we actually carry it out. There's the symbolism and the substance, right? There's the things that are maybe decorative and the things that are actually functional. And so let me give you a small example. When I pray, and every time I pray, I say, in Jesus' name, amen, at the end. Is that just the form or the practice or both? Right? It is a symbol without substance. Like what's in my head when I'm saying that? Am I actually praying in his name? Do I think maybe that if I don't say that I'm not praying in his name? This story invites us to realize that Jesus can come in and kind of maybe critique and say a few things about our forms versus our practice, our symbols versus our substance. And are we okay with him coming in and saying, this ritual of purification is okay. This old wine's wasn't wrong, but let's just turn it all on its head. Let's just do something completely different. Are you willing, am I willing, to let Jesus come into your world and tell you what he thinks about the forms or the symbols, and of maybe a cherished practice of ours? And I'm not talking about, maybe you could extend this to, what we do on a Sunday morning and all that. That's avoiding the question. This is for us individually. When Jesus reveals himself, he comes in and he might say, that thing that you've been doing, there's really nothing behind it. And I hasten to say that it's not the forms or symbols or decorations are not, there's nothing wrong with them. It's whether or not there's good practice or substance or functionality behind it, right? Or is it just an empty shell? And so that's what Jesus does when he comes into this scenario. He's revealing himself, but in that process, he is really confronting and saying some things about the new covenant, about how some of the old stuff needs to go away. And we need to continue to let him do that in our lives. Now, the second thing that I want to get to today is the healing of a sick boy. And there's an interlude here. He goes to Cana. He does this miracle at this wedding. And then after that, he goes to Jerusalem. That's when he upends the temples, the tables at the temple. He goes to meets Nicodemus at night because he didn't want to be seen with Jesus during the day. And they talk for a long while, and he really says some, speaking of Jesus being misunderstood along the way, Nicodemus is like, what do you mean born again? He goes to the well at Samaria and has a long discussion with the woman there and the people there. Then he comes back to Galilee and actually back to Cana, where this happens. And so this is like bookends, but you'll see how John is tying some things together here in these kind of bookends in between these other, around these other events. So let's read that. This is in John 4. Now we're at the end of chapter 4. And he's been in Samaria. Verse 43 says, after the 2 days, he departed for Galilee. He was in Samaria for 2 days. Parentheses in verse 44. For Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in his hometown. The comparison here is between like the Jewish areas of the country and Samaria, right? Because he's not going back to Nazareth or whatever. He's just going back to Galilee. But he's been in Jerusalem. They're kind of questioning what he was doing, right? Nicodemus doesn't really understand what's going on. They're all skeptical in his hometown, in his home country. But he goes to Samaria and enjoys great success, right? They're all like, wow. This woman's like, come out and see this man who told me everything about me, read my mail. And so now he's going back. And verse 45 says, so when he came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, having seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the feast. For they too had gone to the feast. This is the feast in chapter 2. The end of that chapter says that after he had, cleared everybody out of the temple and all that, it says in verse 23 of John 2, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs he was doing. So that's what this verse 45 is referring to. The Galileans welcomed him, having seen what he had done in Jerusalem at the feast. Right? They're like, oh, that's that guy. And so really, they were welcoming Jesus because of the miracles he'd done. Right? That's what's catching their eye. Now, verse 46. So he came to Cana in Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And at Capernaum, there was an official whose son was ill. He's not in Capernaum, but the official's in Capernaum, and then travels up to Cana. This man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee. He went to Jesus at Cana, right? Went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. This official would have been like not a king, but somebody that maybe worked for the king, right? He's a person of wealth and power. So Jesus said to him, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And he offers this kind of abrupt statement there. And two things you need to know there. One is that the yous there are both plural. He's not really just talking to the official. He's saying, you people, right, the Galileans. Unless you see signs and wonders, unless y'all see signs and wonders, y'all won't believe, right? All of you. And second is that signs and wonders. Right? I told you that he uses signs mostly to talk about these miraculous works. He's tying the two together, signs and wonders. In other words, signs that were also involved power. Not every sign might involve a display of power, but he's specifically talking about the ones that do. In other words, Jesus, they wanted Jesus to prove himself, right? We see this in other places in John where they're like, show us a sign, right? Do a miracle for us. And he's saying, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. That this official wants to kind of use him for that. The official said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." The verb tense of the word "said" there kind of is called the imperfect. You don't need to remember that. Just that it means that it implies kind of like a continuous. Like he kept asking. He kept asking. He was persistent. He kept saying, "Come down, come down." And also, in the Greek, when he says before my child, it's kind of a Greek term for endearment. Like he's saying, before my little boy dies. So he's kind of wrecked about this, the official. And he's like, come down. Jesus said to him, verse 50, go, your son will live. And in the Greek, there's this contrast. There's this where it's kind of obscured a little bit in the English translation, but Jesus is saying, or the official saying, come, for my little boy dies. And Jesus responds, go, for your son lives. Come, for my son dies. Go, for your son lives. They're both kind of a command where this official is like, come. And Jesus responds in kind. Go. My child dies, your son lives. And he's reversing that. And he also makes it that the official has to do something. He has to believe, right? He could stay there and keep trying to get Jesus to come down and all this stuff, or he could just go back home, believe what Jesus said, and go back home. So he wants this miracle. He wants to maybe exploit Jesus a little bit. And Jesus puts this moment of faith. And we read in continuing in verse 50, that the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, went on his way. As he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better. And they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. The father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live. And he himself believed, and all his household. This was now the second sign that Jesus did when he came from Judea to Galilee. Not his second sign ever. Remember, I said in verse 223, it talks about him doing signs in Jerusalem. But this was kind of the second sign in Judea, in Galilee, right? So John is kind of making a point. Right? He's bookending these stories here with these two moments in Galilee. So this ties into, we see two contrasts here. Verse 11 of chapter 2 says that this was the first of Jesus' signs that manifested his glory, and the disciples believed in him. That these signs, resulted in faith. But the other one, they wanted Jesus to do a sign for them so they can believe and kind of prove himself, and they want to just get something for themselves. And Jesus is saying, you won't believe unless you see a sign. So once again, at a basic level, this story is a story about compassion. Like this official was maybe wanting to use Jesus for some benefit. Maybe he was trying to swing around some of his wealth and power. Like I'm important. I insist that you come to my house and heal my little boy. And Jesus did it, right? Like in the end, he didn't say, no, you're just trying to be whatever, or if I heal him, you won't believe anyway. He still healed him. Like that's his compassion. But at a higher level, this is kind of a sophisticated comment on the relationship between faith and miracles. Especially both of these stories, the end of what the disciples did when they saw the water turned into wine, and then this story, and Jesus is saying, you're not going to believe unless you see signs and wonders. So the way it goes is God reveals himself through signs. I'll use the word signs like John. Sometimes these signs involve like a really obvious display of supernatural power, right? And so when those signs do involve that, will we, observing that, see just the power and go, wow, that boy was healed? Or will we see, wow, Jesus turned that water into wine? Or will we see the divine revelation that is coming with that sign? It's not just a display of power for us to go, wow, that's pretty awesome. Wow, he really is God. It's so that there'll be faith. It says the disciples, when they saw that, they believed in him. It's so that we'll see a revelation of who he is and put our faith and our trust and our belief in him. It's a lot easier to accept a miracle that benefits us directly than it is to accept a divine revelation of who God is and who we are. Right? It's a lot easier to accept this miracle. Yeah, it's great. I mean, I was talking to somebody, or this is a while back, but he used the phrase, it's like a Santa Claus Jesus, you know. He gives us the things we want, right? That kind of relationship with Jesus is easier to say, well, I just need this, please give it to me, okay. Than to really accept with these signs that there's a revelation that says something and therefore demands a response from me. Like, it might be uncomfortable. It might show me that I have a lot to learn. It might show me that I have not a great understanding of who God is. It might mean that I need to forgive somebody that's offended me because God's saying, this is who I am and this is who you need to be. And these kind of revelations can be uncomfortable. It's a light shining in a place that might be a little dark. And it's a lot easier to accept this miracle and not change and ignore the revelation that's supposed to come with it than it is to do the opposite. I mean, the truth is, and maybe you've experienced this, maybe not. I have. I've known people that had such a wonderful work of God in their lives, truly miraculous. And over time, it just got rationalized into, oh, well, it didn't happen. It really wasn't actually that a miracle. That was going to happen anyway. Any number of things over time. And in the end, there wasn't a real change. In the end, it didn't stick. It didn't matter that this was undeniable. Like I was reading a story of a family that the daughter was healed. Like, they gave her maybe, she's going to die within a year. She was healed. They're all excited. They're at church the next Sunday. They're at church the Sunday after that. The whole family. Within a month, just the parents are there. A few months after that, they're back to it didn't change them in the end. And so John, like I said, is making a really sophisticated comment on this relationship between faith and miracles. Now, I'll remind you, Jesus healed in many. Like he still did all these signs. Like he still continued to do them. He still does them today. Paul said to the Corinthians, he said, when I came to you, I didn't come with wise words. I came with wisdom from God and demonstrations of power, so that your faith wouldn't rest on my arguments, on my clever sayings, my clever persuasion. God absolutely uses signs and wonders and signs that make you wonder to show himself. But the point is, we have to say, okay, what is this really about? What is the revelation that is coming with this sign? So, Jesus is this is his first kind of unveiling to the masses, right? At the wedding of Cana, he's had some interactions with John the Baptist, with his disciples. He said some amazing things that really got Nathanael thinking when he called him, and all this stuff. It's in chapter 1, but this is his first kind of public miracle. And what this should do, and what I invite you to do, is to let this push you into a deeper understanding of who he is. Not just someone who has power, who can do things for us. Not just someone who is compassionate. Like that's awesome, and that's something that I've spent several minutes talking about. But what I want to invite you to do is not stop at these places which are good. Okay, absorb all that, soak it in, but then say, okay, what else? This is inviting us to ask some deep penetrating questions. Who is this person? This singular person that invaded our history? Who is this Messiah, this Jesus? What has he done for us? What does he continue to do? What does it mean when he said, by the way, the new wine is better than the older wine? I saved the best for last. What does that mean to you when you're going to work? Like, this invites us to ask some deep questions. And I invite you, is to ask these deeper questions and to sit with this amazing person and the things that John is telling us about him. And like the disciples, that his glory would be manifest to you, to have a glimpse of his glory, which is the exact reflection of God the Father. Okay? Yeah. Let's pray.